So welcome. And
Thank,
yeah,
thank you so
yeah,
much, Tom. It's a privilege to be here. And the wonderful thing about being here is now at last, after a day of being in many different places at once, which shouldn't be possible, I am completely here.
all right. Wonderful. And we are so pleased for that. So I'm going to start. Those of you who have seen one or both of the previous programs will know that there's a couple of different um, questions that I have asked each of the speakers, and one at the beginning, one at the end, and then other than that, it's a wide-ranging conversation. But so one of the questions that I've asked everybody that I'll start with here is, Jane, if you could just describe any kind of recent natural history encounter that enriched your day. And again, natural history broadly defined as we just described, but what's been going on in Jane's world in that regard?
Well, just so people know, I was tipped off about this question in advance, and I came up with two answers, and I want to give you both. So
Excellent.
one answer, and both are recent, so both are genuine recent answers. One is, now that rains have returned to California, mushrooms have returned to California. And I quite recently took a walk with a friend who I often hike with, but I had asked her before we went on the loop, have you been seeing any mushrooms? And she said yes, but she's not a forager, so she had no idea what we might find. And I am a very, very kindergarten level forager. I have an expert I can show things to when I'm at all uncertain what they are. And so we took our hike, and there were indeed many mushrooms. And some of them I know well and recognize, and some of them were entirely new to me. And one thing that I loved about this experience was not only the great joy that comes when we become once again our more mammalian animal selves and look for food in the wild. It is such a deep satisfaction, and it changes, of course, how you walk around and where you look. So I was spending a little more time looking at the ground and a little less time looking at Mount Tam or my friend. I was kind of worried about what her experience of waiting for me to look at all these mushrooms would be. And I loved that, at the end, she said that this was an extraordinary thing for her to get to do because it also transformed the walk for her, in that she too began looking for mushrooms and studying what you could see, how far away, where they were. And one thing I loved was when I was studying the thing that turned out to be probably an Agaricus augustus, a delicious edible mushroom that I had not known before, and my expert had to tell me what it was. She, meanwhile, said, "Oh, Jane, but look, there's this different one." And she had spotted the slippery jack boletes, which I had not seen because I was too busy looking at the brighter gray mushroom that I didn't know. And so I came home with cocora and agaricus and boletes to eat, and two poisonous mushrooms not to eat. Thank you very much, my expert. So that's one recent story. The other recent story is about a changing of attention that came through the other portal, because we have many ways of being attentive, and I wanted to offer you both. And so I have been listening to the marvelous series of podcasts done coming out of Wisconsin, to the best of our knowledge, on deep time. And one or two of those programs that I had listened to adjacent to each other suddenly caused me, when I was out on every day, when I'm not taking a long hike with someone, at the end of the day, I do a little dog trot right out my door, no cars involved, through my neighborhood, which is a loop of, infrequently driven streets and some open space. And I do that loop, almost daily. And because of having my mind and views affected by what I had been listening to and thinking about, I suddenly was dog-trotting along in a completely different condition of relationship to what was around me. So I was suddenly looking at, so there's a place where the road drops off abruptly, and there's a protective barrier fence of, big rough boards bolted into the ground, and on stanchions or whatever, posts, metal posts. And I was suddenly looking at the boards and thinking, where did the trees come from? What kind of wood is this? Where was the metal from the bolts mined? How did it get here? What is under my feet? There's pavement, and under that, there's probably some utilities being run. And under that, there's a certain kind of rock, and full of earth, full of biological life, and then rock, and then imagining it all the way down to the center of the earth and the magma. What was under my feet? And so what I was doing, and this wasn't a mental exercise, it was actually a change of consciousness, was trying to take in, to absorb, to be aware of the full relationship that comes into the part of the present moment that we are aware of, and to expand that awareness in time, space, natural history, engineering, human history, all of those things that go into this, little street in my hometown that I can dog trot along on. And the other shift that came with this came out of two different, very different people speaking on the podcast, two different guests who basically were describing the same thing, very familiar to all of us. So both the physicist Carlo Rovelli and the First Nations botanist and moss expert Robert Wall Kimmerer were talking about the way reality is not made up of objects, it is made up of events. That the fluid, changing world is what we are in fact abiding in, not the separation of something static, but the continuous unfolding of the world felt as verb. And I was plunged into that consciousness as part of this experience of practicing, looking at things not as if I had seen them 10,000 times before and knew exactly what they were, but as things with a lot of aspects and elements to how they came to be within my line of vision, of which I know very little, but which could be known. So those are my two natural history experiences, both of observation, both of close observation, both of consciousness altering observation, but in very, very different ways. One very immediate to the present moment and the animal way of being in the world, and one involving the mind, cognition, imagination, everything we know, everything we might ask.
No, those are wonderful. Thank you. First of all, I want to apologize to the whole group if I start coughing. I'm fighting off a head cold here, but so God, that's very rich. Both of those stories. The first story about the hunting for fungi reminds me that both of our previous guests, Harry Green and Nalini Nadkarni, both said something very similar, but talking about hunting animals. But the same kind of thing that you said about the quest for, having a perception with the lens for seeking food is a pretty fundamental human natural history experience, and that it does affect the way we perceive the world. So that's an interesting follow-up to that. And that second story, well, it reminds me, among other things, that the term natural history itself came from, the Latin historia naturalis, which literally means the story of nature. And as you're kind of saying, that every story has so many different components that you can start unraveling and piecing together, and at any given moment pay attention to sort of different parts of this. So thank you for sharing both of those stories. Well, it would be a shame to have a world-renowned poet on here and not hear some poetry. So if you could share a few poems here, that would be wonderful. And just so everybody knows that, so Jane's going to share a few poems here. and then we'll do so again a few more closer to the end before the Q&A. So don't be alarmed if she finishes sooner than you wish, because there'll be more.
Thank you.
And yeah, and then share anything you'd like to about the context of any of the poems or anything.
So the first one, Tom had told me which ones he would like to hear read, and then I went through them and picked out from the larger set ones that I thought would be good to read for this conversation. And because this conversation is about not only savoring the world but saving it, I thought I would begin with the poem that gives this book its title. The title, The Asking, and I've already mentioned how important, questions are to me, and I'm sure I'll come back to that more. So The Asking isn't the title of this poem, it's the last words of it. The poem was written on New Year's morning, 2021. Some of you might remember that odd limbo time. It was a few days before the events of January 6th. So the election was over, but we all knew things were not quite yet done or changed, and it turns out they still aren't. But I try to start every new year writing a new poem as the first thing I do in the year, a way of setting my intentions. And that morning, I was really thinking, I had spent years taking some engaged political action every single day, including I finally settled mostly on sending postcards. I would put statements on government websites when they were ostensibly asking for public opinion. But I sent a lot of postcards, first to officials, but then more and more to get people to register to vote, to suggest, there are people who supply you with names and lists and what they'd like you to say. And I just wanted to do some of that hands-on direct work of trying to raise the vote count towards the values that I shared. So that's in this poem. And I think that's all. Oh, the last thing I have to say is every year I do a ridiculously thorough house cleaning that needs to be done by midnight, December 31st. And so that also is behind this poem. So here it is. Counting New Year's morning, what powers yet remain to me? The world asks, as it asks daily, and what can you make, can you do to change my deep, broken, fractured? I count this first day of another year, what remains? I have a mountain, a kitchen, 2 hands. Can admire with 2 eyes the mountain, actual, recalcitrant, shuffling its pebbles, sheltering foxes and beetles. Can make black-eyed peas and collards, can make from last year's late ripening persimmons a pudding. Can climb a stepladder, change the bulb in a track light. For years, I woke each day first to the mountain, then to the question. The feet of the new sufferings followed the feet of the old, and still they surprised. I brought salt, brought oil to the question, brought sweet tea, brought postcards and stamps, for years each day, something. Stone did not become apple. War did not become peace. Yet joy still stays joy. Sequins stay sequins. Words still bespangle, bewilder. Today I woke without answer. The day answers, unpockets a thought as though from a friend. Don't despair of this falling world, not yet. Didn't it give you the asking? So very much a poem about savoring and saving and bewilderment and doing something anyhow. Even if stones don't become apples, we do something. And so the next of the poems that were on Tom's list that I chose is a poem that changed my own relationship to how much of an eco-activist I became, not only in things I do in my life and concentrate on in my life, of which I am sadly a fallen example. I have friends who are so much better at changing how they've conducted their lives. I still don't have an electric car. I still have a gas stove. I'm sorry. But I wrote this poem in 2014. And it was a poem where, even though I had been writing about the crisis of the biosphere since far earlier than that, I have a poem called Global Warming that comes from 2004. But the crisis was steepening, and we could feel it steepening. We could see it steepening. And so I wrote this poem imagining the future looking back on us, a future that will know, if it is there to look at all, what we did, how we lived in this pivotal moment for the future of all biological life. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. That poem hopes very much that it will be incomprehensible in 150 years. That they'll say, oh, what was she so worried about? That is what that poem is trying to create. And in me, it became something that I had written, imagined into being, and then really felt I had to live up to. I had to be one of the ones erasing my own poem from meaning. And so a great many more poems speaking into this crisis followed that one into existence. And I'll give you one last poem for this set, an earlier poem called Late Prayer. And I read this poem today because it is very much a poem about the inability to take sides. That, you know, as soon as we start taking sides, we are at each other's throats, and life embraces every side. That could be a shocking thing to say in this moment, but it is the frame of mind of it that I think is somehow an error. And if all of us could just take the side of all of us, then we might find our way towards peace and towards a sensible relationship with the earth. Late prayer. Tenderness does not choose its own uses. It goes out to everything equally, circling rabbit and hawk. Look, in the iron bucket, a single nail, a single ruby. All the heavens and hells. They rattle in the heart and make one sound.
Thank you so much. Jane, could I perhaps twist your arm slightly and get you to read one more specific poem right now? Because there's something I wanted to ask you about it. And that is an older and very well-known poem of yours called For What Binds Us.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you. This is the only poem I think I have by heart, but I don't want to make a mistake, so I'll probably... This goes all the way back to 1982. For what binds us? There are names for what binds us. strong forces, weak forces. Look around, you can see them. The skin that forms in a half-empty cup, nails rusting into the places they join, joints dovetailed on their own weight. The way things stay so solidly wherever they've been set down. And gravity, scientists say, is weak. And see how the flesh grows back across a wound with a great vehemence, more strong than the simple, untested surface before. There's a name for it on horses when it comes back darker and raised. Proud flesh. As all flesh is proud of its wounds, wears them as honors given out after battle, small triumphs pinned to the chest. And when two people have loved each other, see how it is like a scar between their bodies, stronger, darker, and proud. How the black cord makes of them a single fabric that nothing can mend or tear.
Thank you very much. I've loved that poem for many years, and it's always struck me as just it just contains such a deep and compassionate insight on relationship, certainly between two people, and that idea. I was really captured long ago by that idea that you posed there of proud flesh, and I'm just curious in this moment in the world if you think that idea of proud flesh or sort of being strengthened by our scars, you might say, or strengthened by our very woundedness in some cases, can that be applicable to our larger human relationship with the world, do you think? Or for that matter, larger social bodies like, countries,
Yeah.
any thoughts come to mind?
Well, I could give you a really short answer and simply say yes. I absolutely do think that what is untested is also unstrengthened, and that it is by our immersions through abyss and difficulty and dissension and separation that when we find our way past that, connection is strengthened, compassion is strengthened. And any of you who know that poem really, really well could have noticed something, which is I changed the order of the final words. And when I first wrote the poem, I went back and forth, 100 times and chose to end it that nothing can tear or mend. That was how it appeared in its first book. That is how it appeared in the first two printings of this book. But as I have been reading it more recently, I have read it sometimes in exactly the spirit you just proposed. I have read it as a poem about peacemaking in times of war. And that, and when two peoples have loved each other and then fallen apart. And the poem absolutely insisted on changing to what I think is the more optimistic order. So maybe nothing can mend it. Nothing can make that wound not exist. But also nothing can tear the connection. That is the more optimistic order. And so with the next printing or with the paperback, it will go back the other way, 40 plus years after I wrote it.
That's fascinating. That's great. So let me take a step back and ask you what, in the light of the sort of wisdom you've been imparting through the poetries, is almost an absurd question, but why poetry? What at a moment in the world such as we're in, what is the real work of poetry, do you think? Like what does poetry have to offer us as in the larger sense of self?
So when I was writing the introduction to the first book of essays that you held up, Nine Gates, I opened that introduction with a kind of definition of poetry that I still believe, which is poetry is the magnification and clarification of being. But when we think about it, why poetry in this particular moment and era of the world, I want to add something to that. It's not that that isn't true. It is. It is still its primary work is to allow us to feel and see with greater depth and saturation and the clarity of a kind of thinking that includes what can't be known and can't be decided and can't be chosen between. But the other work, I think, why poetry is so needed in the worst times of our lives, personally and socially and historically and politically, is that it does two things. One is it does most poems, most good poems, it preserves the wisdom of interiority. And so if we want to see the great public events that we are also focused on now, we are also focused on what appears in the newspaper and what we hear on the radio. And we must pay attention, because these are the future of the world is going to be different depending on how we behave in this moment of pivot. But poetry is about the preceding moments of action. It is our access to a kind of interior compass that can point in one of any directions. The interior compass that is governed only by fear will point towards self-protection and barricade and at all costs I must. But the interior compass that includes the remembrance of the radiance of the world, which good poems always do. The darkest poem will carry with it the gleam of beauty, the gleam of remembering connection and empathy and compassion. Somewhere it might just be one golden thread in a sea of dark threads, but that will be there. And if we can remember beauty, and if we can trust that existence is also good, whatever else we are observing, then perhaps we will be able to have the inner compass pointed in a direction that reflects the generosity that is at the basis of the entire biological world. Because what is life if it is not exchange and giving of one form of cell to another form of cell, of, the food that offers itself to be eaten, and the one who eats it and becomes the keystone species that preserves the ecosystem in that particular part of the world. We are all engaged in this great collaborative adventure, which after all gave us a world in which oxygen exists in the first place. And so this spirit of generous collaboration, it is an alternative story. To go back to that idea of story, our current culture is so greatly based on the story of competition and survival of the fittest and strength and powerful and powerless. But as my poem Late Prayer said, the hawk and the rabbit, they are both part of one life, of one world. So to feel the world as trustworthily beautiful, which I try to do every morning when I first open my eyes. I have taken up a practice that I borrowed from an Australian phrase of happiness, which is to exclaim, "You beauty." And I have taken up the practice of every time I wake up in the morning and open my eyes, saying to whatever meets my eyes, it could be my mountain, it could be fog hiding my mountain, it could be, the dreary hotel room if I'm traveling for work reasons, but whatever it is I see, I greet it with "You beauty." And that changes my inner compass. And poems hold that knowledge, I believe.
Yeah.
They just do. Any good poem on any subject holds the knowledge of empathy, compassion, connection, beauty, tenderness, whatever else it is. If it's a good poem, it will hold that.
Thank you so much. There's so much I'd like to talk about there. So before I mention anything, though, I just want to remind everybody that we invite you to use the Q&A function if you would like to pose a question or a comment for Jane. We'll get to those in a little bit. So it's right down at the bottom center of the Zoom screen. But there's so much that you said there that I think is really neat. I wrote several phrases down, and one that I circled was remembrance of the radiance of the world. That's beautiful, being embedded in a poem. And I guess in some ways that leads to another sort of topic I wanted to deal with is well, it reminds me of I've sometimes said that you could define natural history as the practice of falling in love with the world.
Yes.
Which is a similar kind of idea. So, which leads to then just what is the relationship between the practice of natural history, as we've been talking about it, and the practice of poetry, and both being practices of attentiveness, clearly, and then anything you might say about that in a general sense, but also just for you personally in your own personal practice, do they feed each other in any way?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And they are necessary for each other. Although, most of the time when I'm out in the beyond human world, I don't think of myself as practicing natural history. I'm just looking around, I'm trying to see what is there to be seen and feel, unless I'm foraging for mushrooms, then I'm probably practicing natural history. But, or, I'm a very bad birder because my eyes are very slow. They don't see quickly and they don't see sharply and well. And so mushrooms are very good for me because they're moving at about my speed for taking in visually.
Water birds would be good.
Yeah, water birds would be good. And, the little flashes, they also carry their own meaning, even if you don't know what it is. They're beautiful. They are, spirit changing. Even if you can't say, that was a green heron. But, for me, I think both are not only, it goes back to that thing of not object, but event. Both are changes of not only awareness, but of relationship. You are in a different relationship to the world when you are observing it in a certain way and when you are expressing it in a certain way. So both are about relationship, both are about interconnection, and both are about participation in something larger than the small self and its worries. And we have to take care of that self, and we have to take care of our worries. And if your irrigation pipe has broken and precious water from the reservoir is spilling out into your garden, as happened to me last summer, because my outside pipes are probably 80 years old. They long precede my being in this house. You better take care of it. And everything else has to step back, because that is this particular crisis that you yourself are the only one who's going to get addressed. Even if I couldn't fix it myself by hand, I still had to be the one to at least go down and turn off the water to the house and live, as it turned out, for 3 weeks as if I were backpacking. took a bit to get everything fixed. But you know, these are about relationships stepping forward as part of how you are in the world. And for me also, one of the lovely things about natural history is, even though, yes, one likes knowing the names of things, so much of it is unlanguaged. And
Hmm.
I thrive in the world that does not have words in it. I don't want to be talking and listening to our language all the time. And for
Mm.
me, there are so many other languages. There are languages of light and shadow. There are languages of temperature and of wind and of plumage that, yes, if I knew more, I could put names to, but knowing less, I can simply absorb the way mosses absorb rain. And
Mhm.
that is sustaining.
Maintaining mysteries.
Mystery is very important. Not knowing is very important.
Mhm. It's really interesting to hear you, a master of human language, to be acknowledging the importance of not only dwelling in that space.
Oh, yeah. I think silence means as much to me as words do. I treasure
Yeah,
silence. And of course,
yeah.
like dark skies, it is rarer and rarer in this world to find
Mm,
real.
yeah, yeah.
Well, you know, it's never complete silence, but there are places so quiet that the level of what you are able to hear alters tremendously.
Yeah, yeah. Um, couple. I want to bring up just a couple of other topics before we turn to some questions from folks that are listening. And again, please, we invite you to put your questions on the Q&A there. But the another whole thread or element that's been a big part of your life, talk about it all the time, but certainly has been that your history, your practice as a Buddhist, and that has been a major part of your life, including rigorous formal training back in the day, and that strikes me as also about practice of attentiveness. And so, how anything you'd like to say about how that weaves in with the attentive practice of poetry, the attentive practice of natural history? How does Buddhist practice fit into that for you?
Well, one way picks up from what we were just talking about when you introduced the idea of mystery. And I
Mm.
said, oh, yes, not knowing is very important to me. So
Mhm.
the particular type of Buddhism, which I have been engaged in all my adult life, is Zen. And in Zen, not knowing is fundamental to the permeability of awareness, which is absolutely essential to being able to take in something new, take in something different. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki called this beginner's mind, and said that, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, only a few. The Korean Zen teacher, Seung Sanim, would teach don't know mind. The great Zen teacher, John Keats, romantic poet of England, who knew nothing, I assume, about Zen, spoke about negative capability as being the mark of great poets, that they are able not to know. And I think that is one of the seats of the awareness of Buddhism, Zen, certainly, natural history, and writing poems, which is that the kind of attention you bring is first, primarily, the attention of asking a question rather than making an assertion, saying, what is this? What am I feeling? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What might be? That basic condition of asking rather than declaring, I think, is at the taproot of all three of these ways of being in the world. And so that is what I wanted to say. I'll add one more little piece of tidbit, which is I couldn't help but think of something Gary Snyder wrote in one of his essays decades and decades ago, which is his hypothesis that meditation was discovered by hunters who had to sit unmoving for many hours by a path so that they would be invisible to any prey who might come down it. And that by sitting quietly and unmoving, but with awareness for hours and hours, the state of mind which is learned in meditation was first discovered. I think that's a marvelous premise.
It makes total sense to me, and that natural history is in many ways sort of the roots of various mindfulness practices. I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, but one thing that I read of yours many years ago, I for years had at the top of a syllabus that for a course I taught in field natural history, your phrase, "Everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention." And I read that you had written that, and I can't remember exactly the context. It was for
Well, I didn't actually write it. I said it in a phone conversation with somebody who had been he'd been offered a contract to write a book covering all Buddhism, and he was complaining to me on the phone. He never did do the book, but he was complaining to me on the phone, and they've only given me 40,000 words. And yeah, that's pretty short for a book. And I immediately answered, but Roger, 40,000 words. Yes, you're right. That's either way too few or way too many. You really only need 7. And he said, what are they? And I had never thought about this before. And somehow, in the desperation of having to say what the 7 words that hold all of Buddhism are, that is what I said. Everything changes. Everything is connected. Pay attention. And, there are many things which aren't there on the surface. Compassion has to be found with the acknowledgement of connection. But basically, if you pay attention to those 3 phrases, you probably can find everything else from it. And years after I first said it, I realized, well, then you really only need the last 2, because if you pay attention, you'll see that everything changes and everything is connected.
Right. Which I've put forth as that's the most boiled down definition of natural history as well, is pay attention.
Yeah.
And so when I came upon that, I thought, well, that's if that's a great summary of Buddhism, it actually is a pretty great summary of natural history and ecology as well. So that was pretty fun. So we're running a little short of time because I want to make sure we have time to get to some questions. So and I do want to ask you at least one other question, but maybe it would be a nice time to hear a few more poems if you'd be willing.
Okay, I would be happy to. I need to find the ones we decided on. Okay. So I have a garden. And if you have a garden and you live where I live, if you don't do something, the garden will be completely eaten by deer. So I have a fence. But every once in a while, deer manage to find their way in anyhow. And this poem came from one such event. So it's actually describing something very literal, which actually happened with a deer and my fence. But it is also about one of the things we have been talking about, which is this foundation sense of being permeable rather than barricaded in our stance towards the rest of existence. The supple deer, the quiet opening between fence strands, perhaps 18 inches, antlers to hind hooves 4 feet off the ground, the deer poured through. no tufts of the coarse white belly hair left behind. I don't know how a stag turns into a stream, an arc of water. I have never felt such accurate envy. Not of the deer, to be that porous, to have such largeness pass through me. So that was the first one. The next one, okay. If anybody heard a quiet meow, that was the cat Martin, who is either going to leap into my lap or do something. Yes, Martin, I know. Okay, so that was a poem of permeability. This is a poem of the feeling of accountability. And again, describe something which happened and, right in front of me. No wind, no rain. Not here, it was somewhere else. No wind, no rain. No wind, no rain. The tree just fell as a piece of fruit does. But no, not fruit, not ripe, not fell. It broke, it shattered. One cone's addition of resinous cell sap, one small-bodied bird arriving to tap for a beetle. It shattered. What word, what act was it we thought did not matter? Mm-hmm. And the next poem, I think I'll skip the poem which illustrates action taking because it's longer and you said we're short on time. And I will just go. So y'all can imagine action. And now a newer poem from the new section of the asking. And I picked this poem because it is a poem of both gratitude and an answer to something that I feel many of us find as a great dilemma these days, which is, how can we counter despair? Mm-hmm. How can we counter feeling as if you can hardly open your eyes under the weight of what we know is happening in the large world right now, everywhere? And for me, one of the answers of that is, as we talked about before, praise, to see the radiance, to just simply feel the gratitude that I'm still alive. And even what causes great pain to my mind, or just the chronic pains of an aging body, I couldn't feel them if I weren't alive. And so I become, some of the time at least, grateful even for that. Each morning calls us to praise this world that is fleeting. Each morning, waking amidst the not ever before, dressing inside the not ever again, under sunlight or cloud, brushing the hair, not yet arrived at the end-crimped finish, drinking coffee and buttering toast. Permitted to slip into coat, into shoes, I go out, I count myself part, carrying only a weightless shadow, whose each corner joins and departs from the shadows of others. Mortal, alive among others, equally fragile. And with luck, for days even sometimes, this luxury, this extra gift, able to even forget it.
I love that one. Thank you very much. That's a nice lead in to the, I mentioned at the beginning that there was 2 questions that I was asking every speaker. So the other one that I wanted to ask you, and you've certainly touched on pieces of it, I think, but the subtitle of this series is "Facing the Future in This Present Moment," and as have just said, it's a pretty daunting present when we pay attention. So I've been asking everybody, what is the most hopeful, positive world that you can sort of feasibly see in our collective future? In other words, like what's your most hopeful look at where we're going, trying to stay grounded in the realities of what's really going on and what our capabilities are, and not be sort of pie in the sky, but what seems feasible, and or what in the collective future that we will build together. And is
So,
there particular approaches to living, to attitude, or whatever that you would encourage?
yeah, thank you. So when I thought about this, and so of course is another question that I was tipped off to, what I think, this is an answer coming into the first part of it from a tangent, which is to say, I respect evolution so much, and I count on evolution so much, that when I consider this question of imagining how the future might turn out at its best, what I come up with is, how could I envision this? Because it is going to take all of evolution to sort it through. And what may come, because that is the prerequisite for survival, is some new organ of the heart and mind and nature and psyche that will help us make it through to what is needed. Something larger than any planning human mind can come up with, but which will arise because it is needed, and because those of us who are going to live are going to live with the help of all beings, being our teachers and being our collaborators in this. So, I tried first to imagine, what would this paradise future, the rare positive science fiction book look like? And I realized I couldn't envision the unknowable future because it's unknowable, and all I could imagine is a past paradise, my image of paradise, and that is not in the future. That is a construction of the imagined paradise of the world as I have glimpsed it at its best in a few moments of this life, and in art and in historical descriptions. The only other thing that I can say to that part of the question, which is a little bit concrete, is I am made very hopeful whenever I hear anybody talk about the research field of biomimicry, because I do suspect that, given that we are, creatures of technology and engineering, that if biomimicry can really step forward, we will find a way to do what it is we humans like to do, using materials that are far less damaging to the natural world, because they are the natural world's own devices for creating energy, for creating something that stands up and doesn't fall down, for creating spider webs and glue. Even Velcro is an imitation of, the feet of creatures who can walk on the ceiling, and the way burr clover hangs onto our pants as we walk through the wild. And so that, to me, is a very hopeful, small area that I can imagine surprising me, but for the rest, it's beyond me. But when it comes to that second part of the question, what approach or attitude might help us get through. For that, I had an instantaneous and very strong answer, which is, I believe it will be the sense of kinship.
Mm.
And, the Buddhist, there are other names for kinship. The Buddhist word might be interconnection. The scientific word would be, shared genes, that, the genes of a fruit fly or ant are not very different from our own. But the practice of kinship, I think, changes how we treat one another and all beings and all those events that seem to travel under the name of objects sometimes when we encounter them. And I have had the experience of suddenly finding myself going back to a place that I really loved. I suddenly, I didn't decide to do this, it just came out in me. Every little nondescript tree that I walked past, I was saying to it, sister, sister, sister. And of course, there's nothing original in this. This is St. Francis's, canticle of, brother, sun, sister, moon. This is a feeling that pervades every tradition in the world, every myth in which humans become fishes or sheep or trees is an example of this. Every world in which birds still talk to us is this. But, this sense of kinship, this practice of kinship, it restores the care, the respect, the dignity that we would wish to be given by others. It is a word cognate to kindness, So that is the practice. If I were to say, try this practice, the practice would be, take 2 minutes, take 20 seconds of every day, and whatever comes into your awareness, say to it, sister or grandmother or uncle or child. And then, you could try adding, there's another step beyond that you could try once you're, sort of ensconced in this feeling of, I'm looking at this microphone I'm speaking into and saying, thank you, uncle. It's really helpful. How could I be talking to all these people all over the world if I didn't have this lovely microphone? But you could also extend the practice by saying to each of these relatives that we meet, what can you teach me? Mountain, what can you teach me? Light bulb, what can you teach me? But I think that's a bit of gravy. It's not really needed. Because if we look at the world as part of our own family, part of our own largest definition of who we are, each of us and together, then I think this spirit of instruction will just unfold on its own. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, several things come to mind. One, when you were talking about that, I remembered something that I read many, many years ago in a completely different context. It was talking about human health, but somebody wrote, none of us knows enough to be pessimistic. And that really stuck with me, that there's a certain arrogance in assumption of disaster, you might say, even when there's a lot of empirical evidence on certain days. And it strikes me that some of the notes I was scribbling down as you were just talking there was that facing the future is not going to come from a strategic planning exercise, you might say, but it's going to come from paying attention in all the ways we've been talking about, and from trusting ourselves and kind of reaching out our hands and connecting, building the sense of kinship with other people as well. And so yeah, and I was just going to say, and sort of infused through many of the threads we've been talking about, and many things you've said here, is this idea of humility. That when we don't know, when we acknowledge that we don't know everything, and that we don't even know what the future will bring, that's empowering in some good ways.
Yeah. Humility was the very word I was about to say to bring in. So you brought it in yourself. I am a great believer in the wisdom of humility, and
Yeah.
just it softens us. It softens us, and it makes us available to other wisdom, other knowledge, other ways of being. And it's a word you don't hear many people say much anymore. And I've been saying it more and more often over these last years. Just humility, one of the great virtues.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we shouldn't slander strategic planning too much, because some of that is needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we're going to change the energy system over to renewables, it's going to take a fair number of people who are very, very good at strategic planning, and I am grateful to them for what they do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that natural history is, as far as humility, in my experience, natural history is one of the greatest awakenings to humility, because when you encounter not only so much that you don't understand, but some things that are forces that can hurt you, that can fly, all sorts of things, that it's pretty humbling on a daily basis. Well, thank you so much for that, Jane. And I know we've got a bunch of questions coming up here, and I know we've been going for a while, so I want to jump in here and say that, well, first of all, I'll get to as many of these questions as we can, perhaps in some cases fusing a few together if they're overlapping. But also, I recognize that some people may have to jump off. It's dinner time, and where some people are tonight, for example. So I want everybody to know, and I'll mention this again at the end, but if you are interested afterwards in re-accessing this conversation, this whole program will be on the Natural History Institute's YouTube channel. It'll actually be there immediately tonight in slightly cleaned up version as of tomorrow, thanks to Carly. So, okay, so I'll go to the list here, and just a lot of great questions. There's several different questions specifically about poetry. One, and I'll put a couple of them out here, and then you can sort of respond to whatever part you wish. So one says, the darkest poem carries a gleam of beauty, as you say. Do you think that the brightest poem, if it is to be true to the world, would also carry the darkness? And then another question that connects with that says, can you expand on your evocative phrase that poetry preserves the wisdom of interiority? Could you talk more about your interior musings? Okay. So any piece of that you want to take on?
Okay, those are pretty different questions. So almost entirely, I do strongly believe that, great love poems, the greatest love poems, always carry in them the knowledge of mortality, that this will not last forever. And so, yes, the poems of great joy, I believe the joy is only perceptible because there is that bass note of remembering transience. Everything changes. And I've been recently trying, for a reason not worth trying to describe, I've been trying to remember a thought that I had when I went to the exhibit of Calder's mobiles that was at the Whitney Museum in New York City some years ago. And I was pondering, why do I feel this art is so great when I can't find the darkness in it?
Mm.
It just seems to me it was the purest example I'd ever seen, because Calder is just this artist of enormous delight. His circus wire figures and these shapes turning in the wind and their primary colors, and there just isn't a lot of darkness in it. And then I realized that, they are fragile looking. And
Mm.
the pieces that move are displayed very, very carefully so that they won't break, so that they might last. And it is that fragility which counterweights the pure
Mm.
delight and stops it from being something superficial and saccharine,
Mm.
because things get overly sweet if they don't have some memory of that dark thread running through them.
Mm.
Interiority, I almost don't know how to answer, because it just feels to me, so at the core of how I feel the world. I will say, there is a word that we tend to hear in a single one of its dimensions, the word responsibility. Be
Mm.
responsible, our mothers used to say, or our fathers used to say. But buried in this sort of rebuking mandate to be good and to follow the rules and to behave as the world wants you to, there is the idea of response. And response is how whatever we are taking in from outside the perimeter of feeling and thought and spirit and physiological emotion, response can only happen if you feel the thing inside of you. Otherwise, we would be brick walls and rocks who do act, but they act very, very slowly. And we who try to act more quickly than a rock, it is because we are quicksilver creatures who feel within our bodies the resonance and meaning and eloquence of what it is we are taking in through our senses and through our skin. I hope that's any kind of an answer to the question as it was being asked. You're muted, Tom. I don't know how you became muted, but you are.
Oops. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Um, I'm going to skip one because I think we already addressed it since it was posted. One person says that they so appreciate your lovely way of sharing. Were you immersed in the natural world as a child?
Oh, quite the opposite. I grew up in the Lower East Side of New York City in a world of bricks and concrete. And, it was a post-World War II housing project for veterans to raise their families in. And, there were a few scraps of very carefully, weeded lawn and chain link fence intending to take you off of it, keep you off of it. So what my earliest memory was of, I was told later when I described it to my parents, they sort of did the backstory. I remember being, very young, maybe 2 years old, lying on my back somewhere in the country with only blue sky, not buildings, over my head, and behind me some tall hedge, and in my mouth the taste of a blackberry.
Ooh, okay.
So I think I really knew what was missing and longed for it and made my way towards it. So I have, never lived in New York since leaving. When I went off to college, I went to college in a place that, wasn't in the wilderness, but had a bit more trees and countryside about it, and a stream we'd all go skinny dipping in and such. And then, my first job after college with my newly minted degree was to do farm labor. So I worked on a farm for a year and harvested, picked things. I picked corn and harvested pears and peaches and apples. And the last thing of the year was pumpkins for their farm stand to sell for Halloween. And then that closed down, and I got in my red Dodge van and drove off looking for my future. And a year after that, I was living in deep wilderness in the Ventana wilderness in California in the Santa Lucia Mountains, hearing wildcats yowling, walking down the drought-lowered creek in the summer, seeing the stars without urban lights dimming them. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, but I knew what I wanted.
Yeah.
And I'm not sorry for, growing up as a child immersed in great culture.
Right.
I got to go to museums and things.
Someone asked if your Buddhist beliefs help you to notes that you are very calm and calming, and wondering if your Buddhism helps you stay calm in this turbulent world right now.
I am not always calm. Look at all the information you would be missing if you only had one abiding state of being. If you never got angry, you'd never know what's not just. If you never got irritated, you'd never know what you need to change. If you never despaired, you'd never know what hurts your heart. But I think what practice has given me is not so much, a state of calm as the desire to understand things more and more largely. And when you comprehend things from a point of view that is larger than the very indispensable emotions of the personal self going through all of its, somersaults and contortions and pains and insomniac anxiety, there is at least the knowledge that at some point you will not be so racked as you might be in that moment, and that you will see things clearly. And I do think that we see more when we are looking out of that humility of questioning than we see when we are in a rage. Rage puts blinders on you. So it is necessary information. I would not want to never feel angry, but I would not want to stay fixed in a state of anger, because that blinds you to so much that needs seeing. Like, why are you angry? And what might make things better?
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up here pretty soon, but let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more here. Let's see if there's something different. So, well, there's a number, just so you know, Jane, there's a whole series of things thanking you for this evening, and that's how wonderful it has been. One person says that there's a discernible difference between a great and effective poem and a poor poem when you read one or the other. And how would you characterize a great poem?
I've written 2 books of essays. Get this book. 9 Gates, and then its follow-up 10 Windows. Both those books are basically trying to answer the question, what makes good poems good and great poems great? What do they have in them? And so I go through all sorts of, ways of looking at that, from, what is originality rather than being derivative? And, there's 25 pages on that. What are the aesthetic qualities or the memorable qualities? Great poems, I think, always have in them a certain amount of uncertainty, as we've been talking about. Some things are going to be hidden under the surface, and the reader gets the pleasure of unfolding them inside their own response to it. Great poems have paradox. They surprise. They're volatile. But I think maybe what I will say as, sort of one memorable statement, rather than trying to list everything I've ever thought about, would be, I think what makes a poem great is that you are a different person after you have read it than you were before you read it.
Mm.
You understand the world and feel the world differently after a true poem, a genuine poem.
Mm. Mm.
Some discovery has been made which has altered your relationship to self and world and whatever the poem's subject is. And that for me is the hallmark. If
Mm.
I don't feel changed, I will forget the poem immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Well, I think we need to wrap it up because we've been going for about an hour and a half now, and uh, but I do apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to, and uh, so first of all, Jane, thank you so very very much. It's always really lovely to talk with you, and always uh, generates a sense of where wisdom can be received, as Gary Lopez described it, and really appreciate you and your work and your friendship. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us here tonight from literally all over the world. And again, a reminder that this program will be available immediately on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel. We encourage you to consider subscribing to that channel, which is free, and if you haven't done so, to sign up on the Institute's mail list to get notifications of other programs. So, any last things you would like to say, Jane? I didn't mean to cut this off prematurely.
No, I would just like to say thank you for the gift of your own attention. Thank you for how many of us you have taught so much to in your own work over a lifetime in this field and in this set of shared concerns. And I also am just so grateful for the chance to have an extended conversation about things that I care about. And I'm grateful to anyone who finds, in my poems, perhaps something worth them spending their own time on. That, you know, I write them because I have questions that I need to answer, and that anybody else finds them of use is something I am profoundly grateful for. So thank you, and I hope all beings on this earth find something to eat, somewhere safe to sleep, and in their hearts, some sense of the connection that lets us go on. So thank you.